Latest tariffs affecting India. What changed, why it matters, and who wins or loses. Over the past year, India has seen two competing tariff storylines. Domestically, the Union Budget 2025 and subsequent customs notifications rationalized and in many cases reduced a number of basic customs duty (BCD) lines to support manufacturing, while selectively protecting strategic sectors. Internationally, India has been at the center of a major trade shock. The United States has announced and rolled out country-specific reciprocal tariffs that raise additional levies on many Indian exports, most recently adding measures that bring some U.S. duties on Indian goods to as high as 50%. The twin trends, domestic tariff reform and punitive foreign tariffs, are reshaping export competitiveness, supply chains and policy choices for Indian industry and government. 1. A quick explainer, types of tariffs and how they matter. When people say tariffs, they usually mean taxes applied to imports, customs duties. Governments use them for four main purposes: raise revenue, protect domestic industry, encourage or discourage particular goods, luxury items, polluting goods, and as a bargaining tool in trade negotiations. Two technical points are helpful. Basic Customs Duty, BCD, is the headline import tax India levies on a tariff line, and HS code. Governments can add surcharges, cess, safeguard duties, anti-dumping or countervailing duties, all of which add to the effective tax on imports. Reciprocal, country-specific tariffs, as used by some countries recently, are additional duties targeted at imports from a particular country in response to perceived policy or trade practice grievances. These can be temporary safeguards or announced as part of trade policy changes. 2. India's domestic tariff moves in 2025, simplification with selective protection. In the 2025 Union Budget, the Indian government continued a two-track approach, simplifying tariff slabs to make the system cleaner and cutting duties on certain capital or strategic inputs to support manufacturing, while keeping higher protection, or new cesses, on goods the government wants to discourage or to protect nascent domestic producers. Key domestic moves, high level. Reduction and consolidation of tariff rates. The budget proposed removing 7 extra customs tariff rates, reducing the number of slabs and moving toward a simpler structure. The stated goal was to leave only 8 tariff rates, including 0. Several lines saw sharp cuts, for example, BCD reductions on certain industrial inputs and jewelry, platinum findings. Targeted duty reductions to support industry. The government exempted or cut BCD on many items critical to manufacturing, including inputs for EV and mobile battery production, exemptions for cobalt powder, waste scrap lithium-ion battery material, and other battery inputs, and reduced duties on some electronics inputs to lower domestic manufacturing costs. Cuts to edible oil tariffs to ease inflation. In June 2025, the government halved the BCD on major crude edible oils, crude sunflower, soybean, palm, from 20% to 10% to help soften domestic edible oil prices. That move directly targets consumer prices and supply. Why this matters? Rationalizing tariffs and lowering duties on inputs can reduce production costs and encourage investment in domestic manufacturing, Make in India. At the same time, the government retained or introduced sector-specific measures, surcharges, AIDC on certain luxury or strategic items, to protect local producers or raise revenue, so the message is not across-the-board liberalization but calibrated reform. 3. The external shock, U.S. reciprocal tariffs and the 50% headline. From mid-2025 a much larger external shock emerged. the United States used a suite of executive actions to impose country-specific reciprocal tariffs and additional levies on certain trading partners. India was explicitly named in successive measures and notices that added extra percentage points to U.S. import duties on Indian goods, an added duty that together with existing tariffs can push some lines to a combined 50%. The White House published the underlying authority for modifying reciprocal tariff rates under executive orders and relevant notices. How the U.S. measure works. The approach adds an additional percentage charge on top of normal U.S. import duties. In practice, the U.S. listed India under a specific HTS-US provision and applied an extra 25% in an earlier tranche, and then added a further tranche that brings the total extra burden on many Indian lines to 50%. Certain sensitive categories, such as specific pharmaceuticals and some electronics, have been temporarily or partially exempted, but many labor-intensive export sectors face heavy new levies. Scale of the hit. Indian officials and independent estimates have put the value of exports potentially affected at roughly $40 to $50 billion of shipments, a very large share of bilateral trade and concentrated in labor-intensive sectors, textiles, gems and jewelry, leather goods, seafood, some chemicals and parts of engineering. Why the U.S. acted. As publicly stated, the White House framed the measures as responses to trade imbalances and to specific national security or geopolitical concerns. For instance, pressuring buyers to refrain from purchasing Russian crude oil during a period of international sanctions and geopolitical tension. Whether that legal rationale will hold at the WTO or in bilateral negotiation remains to be tested. 4. Sectoral impacts, winners and losers. The distributional effects are uneven. Below are the sectors likely to feel the immediate brunt and those that might gain from India's domestic tariff policy changes. Immediate losers, most exposed to higher foreign tariffs. Textiles and apparel. Large, labor-intensive export base to the U.S., higher U.S. duties can make Indian garments less competitive versus Vietnam, Bangladesh or even near sourcing options. Suppliers to small U.S. retailers could see orders rerouted. Gems and jewelry and leather goods. Both major earners of foreign exchange and sensitive to tariff increases because U.S. buyers may switch sources or demand price concessions. Seafood and certain processed food exports. Perishable goods are price sensitive and face demand elasticity. Higher duties risk rapid loss of market share. Moderates or uncertain. Pharmaceuticals. Many Indian generics exporters are protected by temporary exemptions or carve-outs in some U.S. notices, but longer-term uncertainty could affect investment plans and supply contracts. Electronics and solar equipment. India's domestic tariff and safeguard architecture for solar modules has been complex. Some recent budget moves reduced duties on certain solar inputs while the US side has its own wide set of duties affecting global solar supply chains. Outcome depends on the interplay of domestic incentives and global market rerouting. Potential winners from India's internal tariff changes. Domestic manufacturing for EVs and batteries. BCD exemptions on cobalt, battery scrap and critical minerals are intended to lower input costs for battery makers and attract investments in battery gigafactories. These changes can make India more competitive for cell, module assembly. Importers and consumers of edible oils. The BCD cut on crude edible oils is expected to moderate domestic prices and benefit consumers and food processors. 5. Policy responses. What India can and is doing. India's policy replies have several tracks. 1. Cushion exporters with domestic support. The government has flagged and started to prepare export incentives and logistics or tax support measures, some provisions were already included in Budget 2025, and officials have signaled contingency plans to help affected MSMEs and labor intensive clusters. 2. Diversify markets. New Delhi will intensify trade outreach to non US markets, Africa, ASEAN, Latin America, and the EU, and seek to deepen manufacturing and trade linkages with partners who remain open to Indian exports. Several Indian trade bodies have already started redirecting market development efforts. 3. Diplomacy and negotiation. Despite the rhetoric, both capitals retain channels for negotiation. India is likely to press for carve-outs, seek clarifications about tariff codes, and may explore dispute settlement at the WTO if measures appear to contravene global rules. The outcome will depend on political willingness on both sides. 4. Targeted domestic protection. India has historically used safeguard, anti-dumping and countervailing duties to shield vulnerable domestic producers. In the short run, such measures can be applied selectively if imports distort local markets, though they also risk signaling protectionism to partners. 6. Short and medium-term economic effects. GDP and jobs. Analysts have warned that a steep and sustained tariff shock from the US could shave tenths of a percentage point off India's GDP growth and jeopardize jobs in export hubs, textiles, gems and jewelry, leather. Small firms that rely heavily on US orders are the most exposed. The magnitude depends on how fast buyers resource and how aggressively India supports exporters. Currency and markets. News of punitive tariffs has immediate financial market effects, currency depreciation and equity market volatility, as importers or exporters and investors reprice the country's near-term export prospects. Short-term rupee weakness has been observed around announcements. Supply chain rerouting. Global firms that source from India may consider near sourcing to other low-cost countries for affected product lines. Conversely, for products where India has scale or compliance advantages, some generic drugs, buyers may accept short-term cost increases. 7. Practical takeaways for businesses and policymakers. For exporters and firms, reprice and renegotiate contracts where possible, and review U.S. customer clauses on tariffs and landed costs. Explore alternative markets and fast-track market diversification strategies, regional FTAs, trade missions. Use government schemes, export incentives, credit facilities and budget-allocated support, to blunt immediate cash flow shocks. For policymakers, target relief to MSMEs and clusters rather than across-the-board bailouts, preserve fiscal space while addressing the worst hits. Accelerate supply chain resilience, inputs diversification, logistics, port efficiency, so exporters can mitigate rerouting costs. Keep diplomatic channels open while preparing legal options, WTO, dispute settlement, where appropriate. Negotiations between New Delhi and Washington. Any reversal, carve-out or phased withdrawal of U.S. country-specific duties will be negotiated, not automatic. Watch official statements, trade delegations, and high-level meetings for signs of de-escalation. India's customs notifications and DGFT moves. The government's follow-up notifications, tariff schedule adjustments, exemptions, and safeguard cases will determine how domestic industry adapts. DGFT notices are where practical import-export policy changes appear. Market rerouting and buyers' responses. If major U.S. retailers resource quickly, the immediate pain for certain clusters will accelerate. Conversely, if buyers accept higher prices or are constrained, for unique Indian products, exports may prove resilient. Conclusion. In 2025, India's tariff landscape is being reshaped from both inside and outside. Domestically, the Union budget and customs notifications signaled continued tariff rationalization and targeted support for strategic manufacturing, batteries, electronics inputs. Externally, a major shock, U.S. country-specific reciprocal tariffs that in places raise effective duties to around 50% threatens key export sectors and will test India's export resilience and policy toolkit. The near-term economic effect will hinge on the duration of foreign duties, the agility of Indian exporters, and the effectiveness of government mitigation measures. For businesses, the message is clear: reassess markets and costs now. For policymakers, balance short-term relief with long-term competitiveness.